7 force field. Don't worry. I'll break you out of there. Glad I could help.
Last year, a Pakistan-born Canadian member of parliament named Iqra Khalid introduced a motion in Canada's House of Commons to ban criticism of Islam, just like they ban it back in Pakistan. It was Pakistani values, not Canadian values. We don't ban criticism of any religion in Canada. In fact, it's actually hardwired right into our Constitution. We have freedom of thought and belief and religion. We have freedom of speech. We can criticize or even despise any religion we want to, especially a religion that is implicated in so much un-Canadian politics, whether it's violent terrorism or the soft jihad of creeping Sharia law. But not surprisingly, the motion called M-103 passed. Of course it did. Justin Trudeau made a strategic calculation before the last federal election. Stephen Harper and the Conservatives had won over most pro-Israel voters in Canada, including many Jews themselves. Trudeau couldn't beat Harper on that, so why try? Why not go for the booming Muslim vote? Sorry, I said booming. There are 3 times as many Muslims in Canada as there are Jews, and they're often in battleground ridings. It was smart politics, and so it was done. Justin Trudeau promoted Omar Al-Jabra, the former president of the pro-terrorist, anti-Semitic Canadian Arab Federation, as his right-hand man to campaign in the mosques. Al-Jabra literally called for terrorist groups Hezbollah and Hamas to be legalized in Canada. That was the official policy of the Canadian Arab Federation. That was the perfect guy for Trudeau. And so while Trudeau rarely visits churches in Canada, he doesn't go to church, he almost never misses an opportunity to visit a mosque.
I spend a lot of time running from the Bangladeshi to the Pakistani to the Maghrebien to the Sunni Wahhabi mosques. I cover all the different communities.
So yeah, Trudeau has gone full Islamophile. He does really weird things, like sending out this picture of his mother and his wife in hijab-like headscarves on Mother's Day. That's just weird. He has recited the Shahada. That's the Islamic prayer that is, under Sharia law, the sole requirement to convert to Islam. Obviously, I don't believe Trudeau has converted to Islam. The only thing he worships is himself. And Trudeau panders to, say, gay pride parades just as much as he panders to Muslim mosques where they preach killing gays. I'm just pointing out how Trudeau has gone all in with Muslim politics. He doesn't actually believe in any of it. So when Pakistani-born Iqra Khalid introduced M-103, Trudeau supported it. Of course he did. Not just because he wants to pander to Muslim voters, but because, like with all identity politics, he seeks to divide Canadians into racial and religious and gender lines to get people thinking themselves as black or female or Muslim or whatever, instead of just thinking of themselves as Canadian. So that their individual racial or ethnic identity takes over any other sense of being or belonging. So it can be politicized and weaponized. And anyone who opposes that racial taxonomy, that ethnic division, well, they can be demonized as racist or sexist or whatever. We saw this when Trudeau was asked a pretty basic question in Parliament about returning ISIS terrorists coming back to Canada. It was not a question about Islam. It was not a question about Muslims. It was a question about particular terrorists coming back to Canada after fighting in Syria. But listen to the end of Trudeau's answer. He accuses the leader of the opposition of Islamophobia for merely asking about it.
Mr. Speaker, it's this Prime Minister's that's de-emphasizing Canadian security, and Canadians are tired of it. Conservatives who amended the criminal code to make it an offence to leave Canada to fight for ISIS. It was Conservatives who were focused on giving our law enforcement new tools to prosecute ISIS fighters. This Prime Minister is using a broad spectrum that includes poetry and podcasts and all kinds of counselling and group hug sessions, Mr. Speaker. When will the Prime Minister take the security of Canadians seriously and look for ways to put these ISIS fighters in jail?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Party learnt nothing from the last election and the lessons Canadians taught them. They ran an election on snitch lines against Muslims. They ran an election on Islamophobia and division. And still, they play the same games trying to scare Canadians. The fact is, we always focus on the security of Canadians, and we always will. And they play politics of fear, and Canadians reject that.
Islamophobia. Yeah. If the leader of the opposition, that's his job title, whose purpose is to oppose the government, in question period, where it is the time to oppose the government, if he is called an Islamophobe for merely questioning Trudeau about returning murderers, then you mere citizen, you have no chance, do you? That's the power of the Islamophobe epithet. So, of course, Trudeau supported M-103. Well, yesterday, the Heritage Committee of Parliament that was studying the motion, they released their report. The committee was led by Hedy Fry. She's in charge of the committee. She's the crackpot Vancouver member of Parliament who once stood up in the House of Commons to claim that there were KKK crosses burning in the city of Prince George, BC, as she spoke. She actually put it that way. Now, it was a lie and a slander, and she later grudgingly apologized. There has never been a recorded case of a Klan burning a cross in Prince George in that city's entire history, by the way. But she loved making that accusation, because if you were to deny that there was a cross burning or to challenge her in any way, then obviously you're a supporter of the KKK, right? I mean, it's like when Trudeau repeated the lie told by the Muslim girl in Toronto and her mother a few weeks ago that she had been attacked by an Asian man with scissors because of her hijab. It was later exposed as a hoax, but Trudeau didn't care. He literally claimed that the hoax was still proof of a pattern of Islamophobia. He said that. Sure, it didn't happen, he said, but it was part of a terrible pattern, he said. Try to turn that one over in your mind for a moment, you Islamophobe. Anyways, Hedy Fry was perfect. She saw racism where there was none. She's a perfect fit for the job. Trudeau sees hijab attackers where there are none. That's important if you're going to condemn millions of Canadians as racist for the sin of disagreeing with you, or your open border immigration, or your blind support for radical Islam. You need to be comfortable with hoaxes and false accusations, and Trudeau definitely is, and so is Hedy Fry. So without further ado, let's look at the report that was finally released by this committee. Here it is. It's called Taking Action Against Systemic Racism and Religious Discrimination, Including Islamophobia. You can find it online pretty quickly for yourself. It's more than 100 pages long, and part of that is because both the Conservative and NDP opposition MPs have their own sections of the report. I'll talk about those later. The Liberal part of the report starts with a list of recommendations, and most of them sound like boring bureaucratic blather, but that's the point. Set up all the systems and structures and bureaucracies and staff and budgets, really boring, do it really uneventfully. And then when it's all built and funded, well, then weaponize it. That's how Canada's various human rights commissions were done. Here, for example, recommendation number 1. Recommends updating and reinstating the previous Canadian Action Plan Against Racism and broadening it to include religious discrimination through consultations with civil society, grassroots organizations, and interfaith groups. That's the very first recommendation. So this Heritage Committee has just studied Islamophobia for a month. They've spent millions on it. They issued a 100-plus page report. But see, the Heritage Committee, it had some opposition MPs on it, and it was all done in the open with transcripts and recordings, very, very accountable. So the very first recommendation by the Liberals is get rid of the opposition, get rid of the transparency of Parliament, and just go do deals with individual NGOs, Muslim groups perhaps, like Omar al-Jaber's old racist NGO. No media, no opposition. Keep this going, but get the scrutiny away. Here's recommendation number 2. Recommends the creation of a directorate at the Department of Canadian Heritage, which will develop, implement, and monitor this National Action Plan. Well, of course. Set up a permanent bureaucracy to do nothing but this. Again, it's staff, it's not MPs, so it's not out in the open. No opposition. Hire activists working right out of the Liberal government. That's literally their second recommendation, to perpetuate this whole exercise, to make it a permanent struggle. Recommendation 3 recommends the plan has measurable targets, deadlines, and reporting mechanisms, dedicated resources, and adequate monitoring be implemented to ensure that the plan is sustainable and accountable. dedicated resources. That's how they say money in Ottawa. How many millions of dollars do you think that this will take? How many staff? I'm going to say just within the Department of Heritage, I'm going to say 20 staff and $5 million a year just to start. And of course, it will be disproportionately Muslim Brotherhood style people who are hired there. No progressive Muslims. I mean, it's just going to be Omar al-Jabr types. I'm not going to read all of the recommendations, but here's one, number 6. Recommends that the Government of Canada create a national database to retain and analyze hate crime and hate incident data. Hate incident data. So not a crime, just some incident. Does the hijab hoax in Toronto count? That was an incident. How about a couple of days ago when a Muslim candidate for school trustee in Calgary lied about a racist attack against her that she just made up? That's a hate incident, isn't it? How about, remember that case in London, Ontario, the hijab attacker who turned out to be a Muslim woman herself? I'm going to skip ahead. Recommendation 12 says that the Government of Canada implements an equity lens towards public policy, similar to the gender-based analysis lens, taking into account intersectionality. This lens should include but not be limited to different racial, indigenous, ethnic, linguistic, sexual orientation, gender identity, and religious groups. Oh, so get ready for all sorts of new affirmative action you haven't even thought of before. Gender identity affirmative action, that's my favorite. Here's one that could just be called Give Money to My Liberal Grievance Monger Friends. Recommendation 20 says that the Government of Canada facilitate, support, and fund efforts across Canada dedicated to capacity building for communities to strengthen community involvement, civic inclusion, and leadership development. As in, give money to my political friends. All right, I'm at number 2 already. There are so many big government schemes here. It's incredible. I obviously don't have time to go through all 30 of them, but here's number 22. Recommends the Government of Canada take a strong leadership role to actively condemn systemic racism and religious discrimination, including Islamophobia. So not just politicians speaking for themselves and their party. I mean, if Justin Trudeau wants to do that, that's one thing, but that's not what this is. This is about the government itself. The civil service, the agencies, the bureaucrats, all the programs. They must now be activated to condemn Islamophobia. I'll come back to this in a moment, the definition of Islamophobia, but here's more. Recommendation 24. The Government of Canada develop an education campaign to promote media literacy. So the government will now spend money and hire staff and set up programs to tell us citizens how to think of the media, how to criticize the media, who to trust and who not to trust in the media. The government's going to do that. Yeah, that's how it works in dictatorships. The government critiques the media. In free countries, the media critiques the government. Trudeau's Liberals actually are recommending that the government tell Canadians what to think of different reporters. I mean, forget about just the media, though. The Liberals actually want the government to interfere in every single group at all in this country. Doctors, engineers, lawyers, teachers, with their messages. Here, let me read recommendation 26. The Government of Canada, working in collaboration with the provinces and territories, institute cultural competency training to combat systemic racism and discrimination and religious discrimination that may be embedded or perceived to be embedded within a number of professions, giving professionals the opportunity to immerse themselves in other cultures, to ultimately learn from and connect with those cultures. So that's going to be injected into everything in this country. The government is going to tell you how to think about culture. The government is going to combat your own views because you're a bigot and you don't even know it. And they're going to tell you how to think about these things, but of course they are. Hedy Fry herself is leading the charge here. Doesn't that make you feel good that the woman who sees burning crosses where there are none, she's in charge? Recommendation 27 is that the Government of Canada provide grants. Well, of course. And that they be given to academic experts in Canadian universities to support the creation of research on systemic racism and religious discrimination, which can be used to inform public policy. That's sort of a laugh because, of course, that's all there is on campus these days. For anyone who's been following political correctness for years, it's already fully Marxist, fully politically correct, fully Islamified. Just ask Jordan Peterson or Lindsay Shepherd at Laurier. But hey, a promise of more cash, that'll just ensure that every university professor joins in this culture war, won't it? Recommendation 30, the last one, that January 29th be designated as a National Day of Remembrance and Action on Islamophobia and other forms of religious discrimination. There you have it. That's turning the attack on that Quebec mosque a year ago into a national holy day where we scold people for not liking Islam enough. Even though that attacker has not been on trial yet, has not been convicted yet, has not been charged with a hate crime or terrorism, but in advance, the Liberal government just knows in their bones that he is guilty of hate. No trial needed. And we should all be ashamed nationally because of it. Now let me go to a key word here that I've said a few times now, Islamophobia. Islam is a religion, of course. It is a doctrine. It is a set of ideas. It's not just a religion, though. It's politics, and it's often war and terrorism committed in the name of Islam. If you're not phobic about it, if you're not afraid of it, then I don't think you've been paying attention much since 9/11, have you? Now, on the other hand, Muslims are people, including more than 1 million Canadians. You can criticize or fear or even hate Islam, the idea, without discriminating against a human being called a Muslim. In fact, many Muslims in Canada themselves are critics of Islam, or fear it, or even hate it. Many Muslims came to Canada to get away from a Sharia hellhole like Iran. Here's a few definitions of Islamophobia cited by the Liberals in the report. I'm going to read a bit here to you. A number of witnesses provided different definitions of the term, such as an irrational fear or hatred of Muslims or Islam that leads to discrimination. That was given by Iqra Khalid herself. Or anti-Muslim discrimination or hate. That's by a Muslim law professor at U of T. Well, which is it? Is it a hatred or fear of Islam? Or just an irrational hatred or fear of Islam? So is it okay to hate or fear Islam if you're rational about it, but not if you're irrational about it? And who gets to decide which is which? But the professor says it's discrimination or hate, but against a Muslim person, not an idea. Or here's another one of a dozen definitions. A criticizing or scathing negative opinion that might directly or indirectly cause humiliation or damage to the reputation and or incite to hatred and to violence against a person or a group of persons for the only reason that they are of Muslim faith. That was the definition provided by one of the Muslim experts. So just a negative opinion of Islam now. Or was that a scathing negative opinion? So you can have a negative opinion, but it can't be scathing, but it can't cause humiliation or incite violence. Those are pretty different things. Which is it? It goes on, but it's not resolved. And that's deliberate. Keep the definition of Islamophobia vague so you can use that word any way you need to accuse someone, to charge and prosecute someone. Keep it vague. There's a whole section on what the Liberals call fake news, too, by the way. And by that they mean anyone or anything who just disagrees with them, at least on the subject of Islam. Let me quote. Some witnesses expressed concern over the spread of fake news and discussed the role that government should play in combating it. Mr. Juno Katsuya described the negative implications of the spread of fake news and stated, "The era of fake news and alternative facts have contributed a great deal to that insecurity taking root." He added, "We're constantly bombarded with fake news, fake facts, or alternative facts is an issue that we're facing and we can't dismiss. Today, young people are always on social media. It takes about 15 minutes to write fake news, but it takes months to counter it." As a solution, Mr. Juno Katsuya noted that Canada has the necessary laws and regulations in place, but stronger enforcement of these policies is necessary, unquote. So that's a former CSIS agent who's become an advocate for censoring journalism that he criticizes as being critical of Islam. He has called for the licensing of Quebec radio hosts to be taken away because they don't like Islam. The Liberals haven't laid out a plan to do that in this report. That will surely be done by these perpetual bureaucracies that they're going to create. But you can see that they approve of this former spy's talk of censoring journalists he doesn't like. These Liberals talk about having training sessions for journalists who aren't yet on board with the official Liberal narrative. Let me quote. "The media play a role in perpetuating and sustaining ideas about Muslims as violent, As a solution, she suggested that media outlets offer training sessions so reporters can understand when they are participating in conversations that include entrenched ideas about Islam as inherently violent. Such training could assist in preventing the spread of misinformation or fake news. Ms. Chowdhury added that when racist and discriminatory misinformation is presented in the media, it is the responsibility of political leaders to really lead the nation and to call out Islamophobia or systemic racism when they see it and when they hear it. Got it. Guys, there are just too many stories about Muslim terrorism and Sharia law and female genital mutilation and honor killings. Too many reports of it. So the solution is to stop reporting it. And the government will help see to that. Let me say that this is a report by a parliamentary committee. It is not a bill, which is a proposed law. It is not that. It's just a report. Much of the report actually isn't about Islam. There's a lot of other issues in here, Aboriginal issues, black issues, poverty issues. I think that those were all put in for padding, to gin up political allies in the identity politics game. Most of the proposals go to building new bureaucracies and budgets, and that's where the rubber will hit the road in the months and years ahead. What this report is, it's a boiling down of the witnesses that spoke to Parliament, who called for censorship of ideas, who called for criminalizing criticism of Islam, who called for government interference with every aspect of life, from the media to the professions to law enforcement to schools. The details will come later from the Liberals, but these are the broad strokes. They're going to ban wrongthink on Islam. Now, the Conservatives have a dissenting report at the bottom of this. I think they get a big point right when they say this, and I quote, "Unfortunately, Islamophobia has received many definitions, and the failure to use just one definition for the word is highly problematic. We believed that the motion would have better achieved its goal by condemning, quote, all forms of systemic racism, religious intolerance, and discrimination of Muslims, Jews, Christians, Sikhs, Hindus, and other religious communities." All right, but even that is timid because it accepts the premise that Canada is systemically racist. I'm sorry, we're not. It suggests that it is government's role to condemn any criticism of religion. It is not. The Conservatives point out that the Liberals overstate the gravity and the quantity of hate crimes in Canada. Of course the Liberals do. Their demand for hate crimes or hate incidents exceeds supply, so they rely on hoaxes and loose definitions. They need to believe that Canadians are hateful because they have their remedies and budgets and staff all ready to go, so there has to be a problem for them to solve. There is one very powerful passage in the report that I'd like to read out. This is from the Conservative Minority Report. And we know this is true from the Liberals' treatment of progressive Muslims like Tariq Fatah and Raheel Raza and Zuhdi Jasser, who all testified. Let me read this, and this is a fair bit, but I like this part from the Conservative Minority. "One of our greatest concerns was that the Liberal MPs consistently failed to treat moderate Muslim witnesses respectfully. They deliberately avoided Muslim witnesses and their personal testimony, much of which testimony was critical of the use of the term Islamophobia, which spoke to the consequences that a fluid definition would have on public policy, and which addressed potential restrictions on the free speech and beliefs of Muslims and non-Muslims alike. On 2 occasions, moderate Muslim witnesses were belittled by Liberal MPs and accused of being divisive or of being complicit via guilt by association, of complicity in right-wing extremism. Liberal MPs even resorted to the practice of filibustering their own question time in an attempt to avoid inconvenient testimony," unquote. So true, so obviously the Liberal way. There are some good recommendations from the Conservatives, and I ought to read them to you. Here's a couple. That the Government of Canada cease using the term Islamophobia because of the inability to agree on the specific definition of the term. That the Government of Canada cease using the term Islamophobia because groups outside of Canada will use that to justify acts of violence and terror, particularly against women and girls, unquote. Exactly right. See, Justin Trudeau and Ahmed Hassan, the Muslim immigration minister, they love to condemn Canada as a hateful place. They love to scold us. They love to call us Islamophobic. Not only is that not true, but it could justify Muslim attacks on Canada. After all, if we hate Muslims, surely we should be attacked. Here's another good one. That the Government of Canada reiterate its full support for the protection of free speech in Canada, and that the government reject any call to further restrict free speech within Canada. That's a good one. Here's another. Again, this is from the Conservative Dissenting Minority Report. that the Government of Canada launch a public information campaign on female genital mutilation being a harmful practice. Yeah. Not only would that help Muslims in Canada, obviously, but it would probably lower anti-Muslim feeling, because whenever Canadians see the subjugation of Muslim women in Canada, usually by Muslim men in the name of Islam, and it's always approved of by white liberal men and women, I think it undermines our community cohesion because it's contrary to Canadian values. So eliminating the worst aspects of Islamic culture, the subjugation of Muslim women, that would not only help Muslim women who would be liberated, but it would make Canadians warmer towards Muslims, I'm sure of it. It's hard to make friends with someone wearing a black smock over their whole body and face, especially when you learn that is a statement that those who aren't covered from head to toe are haram, they're dirty. On the whole, it's a good minority report, and it reasserts the conservative belief that Canadians believe in both freedom of religion and freedom of speech, and that you can stand for that while still opposing the rare cases of actually criminal anti-Muslim bigotry in Canada. One last word. The NDP has their own minority report too, of course. It's like the Liberals, but worse. They actually complain about Canadian sanctions on the terrorist state of Iran at one point. Seriously, they want those sanctions lifted. Oh, and they are all about censorship and government teaching people what to think. I exaggerate not a bit. Let me quote this next recommendation. This is from the NDP. They say that the Government of Canada develop a strategy to address the spread of false information and fake news through social media. Oh, really? Recommendation 29, that the Government of Canada explore and make available tools that will help individuals identify and recognize their own internal biases. Censorship of the media, of course, yeah, the Liberals love that too, but that second one, having the government tell citizens, individual citizens, to purge themselves of wrongthink, to condemn themselves. That is downright Maoist. That's what they did in the Cultural Revolution. Of course, the NDP proposes that. Look, M-103 is a direct Sharia-style attack on Western values of the separation of mosque and state, of freedom of conscience and freedom of religion and freedom of the press and freedom of speech. The fact that Liberal Ottawa is also using it as an excuse to spend millions, maybe billions, and hire hundreds more staff, well, that shouldn't be surprising either. This report is not the end of the challenge. It is just the beginning of it. It's the rough contours of what's to come. Some will come in the form of proposed laws, I'm sure, but much will come through regulation passed privately. Some will come through budgets. Most will come through vague policies, through a new mindset that the government now has the right and the duty to correct your thinking in support of Islam. And the national shrug that greeted this by the media, by professors, by civil liberties lawyers, suggests that process is already well underway. I mean, imagine if Stephen Harper's government had issued such a report calling for all of these things, but not in the service of Islam, but rather of Christianity. Could you imagine? It would be a national crisis. The UN itself would object. It would be all the media and all the establishment could talk about Stephen Harper forcing Christianity on the country, but to harness the full power of the state to support Islam, to stop the criticism of Islam, to modify every single aspect of society, to stamp out criticism of Islam. Well, yeah, that's the path we're on in 2018. And the fact that I absolutely know you have not heard any of these preceding things on the CBC or the Globe and Mail, well, that proves my point, doesn't it? That's an excerpt from my daily TV show, The Ezra Levant Show. Normally it's behind a paywall, but I thought you'd like this video, so we put it on YouTube. If you want to subscribe to watch the daily show every day, including always 2 interviews a day, and I read my hate mail, just click on this screen and become a premium member.